Welcome back. I hope that you now have your cup of coffee in your hand. Do you have coffee, Mark?
I think we need Red Bull.
Yeah, so we getting ready now for our next speaker. And again, everything that we try and solution for the dealers, because probably a little bit of our pain points as well as dealers. There's nothing as painful as not knowing. So, and I mean, for the longest time, we actually didn't even know that we could get somebody from SARS, For the longest time, we thought that these people never interact with us. So it's quite great, and great to have you, Martin, join us today. It's such a privilege for us. I don't know if I've ever spoken to somebody from SARS, because I'm scared of you guys.
I was trying to butt you up, Martin, so that he just.
I almost said the wrong word here. But anyway, yeah. And yeah, really great to have you, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. We also know that it's such a busy day throughout, and certainly for SARS as well, it's quite a busy day. But just for you to take your time today, we truly appreciate it.
Thank you, Sabinello. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, man.
I'm going to allow you to introduce yourself, Martin. I know that you are an educational consultant and taxpayer engagement in KZN, but You'll probably just elaborate a bit more for our audience to understand exactly what it is that you do.
Okay, thank you, Sabinello. Thank you, Mark. My name is Martin Naidoo. I'm joined with my colleague, Mlu Dlamini. We're from SARS, and we're from a division called Taxpayer Education, should I say. Key aspects of our role is to provide a lot of free educational tax workshops. By doing this, we just help taxpayers to meet their obligations. So ultimately, there's always a need for education, and our department has been providing these workshops for years. I'm very amazed that Sabinello is stating that you don't get somebody from SARS. I've done a lot of presentations for WR CETAs and other CETAs in the KZN region. So I'm actually a familiar face in the CETAs itself, because I've taken on a role just to make sure that then the stakeholders actually understand the learnership's allowance or the incentives that's available for them. So that's a brief introduction of myself. So I don't know if I can start my presentation now.
Please go ahead.
Okay, Tommy, can you see the presentation in front of you?
Yes, we can. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right. So what we're going to generally do is start by basically on skills development levy. I know Shirley has taken you through the CETA side of it. She has spoken about the levy. So let's talk about skills development levy and how it actually generally affects you as a normal taxpayer. Okay, so basically the levy is a compulsory levy scheme. It was introduced in 1st of April 2000 and is payable by the employers on a monthly basis. So on a monthly basis, the employer works out based on their payroll 1% of the total remuneration that they paid for their employees. Okay, so we at SARS, we basically do the administration or the collections of the levy. So we collect the levy and we provide to the Department of Labor as a collecting agent, and the Department of Labor basically does the administration of how the levy is spent. Okay, so on a monthly basis, if you're an employer, you would be deducting and submitting this on an EMP 201 and paying it over to SARS monthly. With regards to the skills development levy, now it comes in two ways, whereby we're looking at one, the CETA itself, okay, and that's governed by the Minister of Higher Education and Training. He is responsible for the Skills Development Act, and Shirley did mention that in her presentation as well. we at the South African Revenue Service, our commissioner, he's responsible to administer the collection, just to collect the SDL from all these employees and make sure that it's actually passed over to the Department of Labor, so that the Skills Development Act will then prescribe how those funds are then utilized and how it then benefits the employers when it comes to the learnerships that we're going to talk about shortly as well. Okay, so generally how it works and who should register for SDL. So we're saying any employer who pays a remuneration of more than 500,000 over a 12-month period should become liable or should register for skills development levy. Okay, so when you are registered for skills development levy, it's up to you as the employer, based on the industry that you are in, you will fall or form part of a specific SETA. So it'll be a sector based depending on the industry you are. So in instance such as PetroCONNECT, I think you would actually fall under the retail industry. That's a WR SETA. So once you register for SDL and once you become liable, you need to inform SARS that you are liable for registration. We will then activate the skills development levy on your SARS profile for PAYE purposes. That means now going forward, you'll have a facility or function on your monthly EMP 201s, which is your monthly declarations to SARS, to declare it and pay it over to SARS. Okay, so there would be the registration process for skills development. One, if you're an employer that's registered for e-filing, that means you're active on our e-filing system and you registered as a registered and you activated as a registered representative, then you can go and register for SDL online without coming into a SARS office. Okay. Whereas if you don't have e-filing, you can book an appointment with SARS to come into a SARS branch and do a registration at the SARS branch itself. So that means coming into a SARS office. Now, due to COVID restrictions, SARS has gone by the rules of we work by appointment basis only. So in order for you to book an appointment with SARS, you can actually contact our call center. You can send an SMS to SARS and then we will call you back to book an appointment. Or alternatively, you can go onto the SARS website and you can do an online booking there. Okay, so you can either get an opportunity to do a walk-in appointment where you come into a branch and you can sit down with a consultant face to face, or alternatively, you can do a telephonic engagement whereby you don't need to come to SARS and your appointment can be done over the phone. Okay, in an instant for the registration for skills development levy, there are certain entities that we will find that are exempt from registering for SDL. Okay, so if you're looking at the entities that we would are employers that any public service employers in the national or provisional sphere of government. Okay, any national or provisional public entity if 80% or more of its expenditure is paid directly or indirectly from funds voted by Parliament. Okay, so also PBOs, non-profit organizations, if they are registered for SARS and they've been granted exemption by SARS, then they will be exempt from registering and paying SDL with SARS. And then also any municipalities which have a certificate of exemption that is issued by the Minister of Higher Education or Training, they will also be exempted from registering for and paying SDL over to SARS. Okay, so also any employee whose total remuneration is subject to SDL, okay, which is the levyable amount that's paid over to us, okay, that doesn't exceed the 500,000 limit. Okay, they are also not required. As soon as they go more than that 500,000, if they're paying remuneration of more than 500,000 in any 12-month period, then they would have to register. But if they're below it, then they don't need to register for the SDL or skills development levy itself. Okay, so the levy itself, the payment, like on a monthly basis, the employer, either they're working on a payroll system or they're doing manual payroll. Okay, when you say manual, that means they're calculating their payroll manually according to the tax tables. Okay, they would need to deduct the SDL or contributions and pay it over to SARS on a monthly basis. So if you're registered with SARS for PAYE, then you get an automatic registration for UIF, and then SDL is also included in that if you are liable. Okay, so on a monthly basis, the employer will deduct the SDL, okay, and pay it over to SARS on the EMP 201, which is the monthly declaration itself. Okay, that EMP 201 declaration is required to be submitted by the 7th of every month. If the 7th falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or public holiday, then it has to be on the last business day. They have to submit the EMP 201 to us. If they do not submit on time, then we would impose penalties on that. Okay, so the deduction of SDL has to be done monthly, as I've informed, but the records has to be kept, okay, for a period of 5 years. Now it's 5 years from the time you submit an assessment to SARS. So the reason why we state 5 years is that we can go back as SARS and look if, for example, you were required to register for SDL and you failed not to. We can go way back 5 and look at your records that you've kept and maybe raise assessments on that. So keep records for a period of 5 years. However you keep it, you must be able to provide it to us if we require that information. So that's just a small on what SDL is. Now, the reason why I said let me start with SDL, because then it comes to the learnership allowance. Okay, so for the learnership allowance, we'll just do a basic overview. We'll talk about the application of the law. We'll talk about the allowances and the requirements. We'll talk about persons with disabilities. Okay, so let's look at the basic overview on the learnership itself. Now, as the previous presenter as mentioned, okay, is that as employers, we want to make sure that you encourage skills and employment, okay, skill sharing and increase employment in the country. Now we know that our unemployment rate is very high in South Africa, okay, and based on the unemployment rate, government has put into place specific incentives that employers can utilize in order for them to actually get incentives or benefits from it. Now, the learnership allowance is one of the incentives, but we also have what we call ETI, which is the employment tax incentive, okay, which is we could at a later stage do a presentation on that. But the incentive itself is based on an agreement, and we will give it in the form of an allowance that will benefit employers. As we go through this presentation, you will understand what I'm referring to. Okay, so a tax relief is granted to employers that have entered into a registered learnership agreement with that person, okay, that were not employed by them when the learnership agreements were entered to, as well as existing employees. So on a basic overall, when we look at the learnership incentive itself, we want to do one is skills development, sharing of skills, because if you pass on skills to your employees, even if that employee leaves your employment, they can actually use that skills in another environment. Okay, that's one. Also, if you take an employee and put that employee onto a learnership, okay, and they get a NQF level of skill, okay, that will actually create more job creations for them. For example, a lot of youths, when they finish their matric, they don't have funds to go and study. So when they're applying for jobs and they put on the CV, you're going to see there's no working experience and there's no educational qualifications. Okay, and that employee will generally not be able to get employed because of those. Because most employers want experience and they want some kind of qualification. Okay, but if you don't have those qualifications, don't have the skills, then they're not going to get employed. Okay, so as I said, it encourages skills development, job creation, and by providing an additional tax deduction for formal CETA registered training programs. For example, the previous speaker, Shirley, she actually advised that, they run programs. They have different programs. They have your NQF levels, and then they have the short-term programs as well, that if they further, they can go into an NQF level as well. Okay, so let's look at the law and how the law works. Okay, so the application of the law, and we'll just talk about it, it works around Section 12H of the Income Tax Act. So that's how that's where we work with, and that's where this learnership incentive forms part of. Okay, also, to get more of a better understanding, I would always advise when I do this presentation, okay, that you look into Interpretation Note 20, Issue 8, and that was as of the 28th of July, 2021. So that gives you a complete breakdown, and you can utilize it. Now, why we say it's an interpretation note, instead of going towards the act, the interpretation note actually brings it down to a layman's term for you to basically understand how this law applies. Okay, so when we look at Section 12H, okay, so in Section 12H, it provides a deduction to an employer in addition to any other deductions that the employer already is allowed. Okay, based on the fact that certain requirements are made that. Okay, so when we look at the requirements, we're talking about 3 factors in order for you to utilize the deductions of Section 12H. Okay, so there's 3 factors. 1, there has to be an employer, there has to be an employee. Okay, so, okay, and the third one is there has to be form of what we call a remuneration. Okay, so employer, employee, remuneration. Okay, if there's those 3 factors in place, then if you are accredited to a CETA, okay, then you can take your employees, okay, and sign up what we call is a learnership agreement. So taking your employee, him or her, and putting them into a learning environment. Okay, so the next step is what we call is a registered learnership agreement. So firstly, the employer needs to have an agreement with the employee to show that there is an employment agreement in place. Okay, they have to stipulate the terms of the employment and the remuneration that they paid. That employer will generally then choose the employee to put them into a learnership. Okay, now in that form, there has to be a learnership agreement. Okay, once there is a learnership agreement between the employee and the employer, okay, and a registered CETA, okay, then that employer we will regard as the lead employer. Okay, and the lead employer is the only employer that can claim the allowances under Section 12H. Okay, so in practice, what we say, the lead employer will usually be the employer that pays the learner's remuneration. Okay, so we've discussed that. Okay, it is not a requirement in Section 12H that the employer must be registered with the same CETA. So what we're saying is you might have an employee that is registered with you, okay, at a CETA, but that employee maybe resigns and joins another employer. Okay, that employer can allow that employee to still continue that learnership, but it depends now. When the employee was with employer A was then considered as a lead employer. So the employer A would have been able to claim certain allowances, okay? But now that employee is moved to employer B, and that employer B is now paying that remuneration, then employer B will be now considered as the lead employer. Okay, I'm just giving these concepts, lead employer concept is just that when we go into what the allowances allow that can be claimed, then you'll have a better understanding who can claim and who can't. Okay, so the allowance, it's not linked to the skills development levy. So employers who are not levy payers can still claim the allowance. So if even you have employers that maybe don't meet the 500,000 threshold, so they're not registered for SDL. However, they can still claim, or they can still be a party to a CETA, okay? And they can actually have an agreement in place, and they can still claim that allowance itself. Okay, so let's look at the allowance and let's look at the requirements. So the allowance is broken down into what we call an annual allowance, and then we have a completion allowance. Now, the annual allowance is subject to a pro rata reduction if the registered learnership agreement does not cover a full 12 months during the year of assessment. Okay, you would have different rules that apply in determining the completion allowance. Okay, for registered learnership agreements spanning periods that's less than 24 months and those which cover longer periods. The amount of these allowance is increased if the learner is a person with a disability. Okay, so let's look at the annual allowances first. Okay, so one thing I just want to maybe share with you is the following, okay, which is commencement date. Okay, now the commencement date works on the following factors. Is based on the fact is how the financial year ends work. Okay, so most companies have February year ends, and as Sabanello was saying, is that today is the end of the financial year. So that means provisional tax is now due. So certain companies will have February year ends, and certain companies might have different year ends. So when we look at date of commencement, we are referring to when can that lead employer start claiming the allowances. Now, learnership allowances or learnership agreements, you will never get it likely that an employer will sign a learnership agreement on the first day of that company's financial year end. They usually will sign it during the course of the year or at a latter part. Okay, so for example, when we look at the example in front, this company has a financial year end of February. That means that financial year end will start on the 1st of March and end at the end of February. Okay, so in this part, in this example that I'm showing you is that this employer had signed an agreement with an employee on the 10th of January. Now, when we're saying sign an agreement, we're talking that it's signed between employer and employee. That means they didn't lodge it with the CETA as yet, but they signed it. So as of the 10th of January, that means this employer can start claiming an allowance of completion earned, okay, based on the date of commencement, which would be from the 10th of January. So when we talk about pro rata, we will pro rata based on date of commencement for that financial year. Okay, so just want to just quickly swap over to the other presentation. Okay, so when we look at the allowance itself as based on the annual allowance, okay, it can be, you will qualify for it during a year of assessment where the learner is a party to a registered learnership agreement with the employer. That's where I spoke about the commencement date. So the employer needs to have a learnership agreement with that employee. That agreement needs to be signed off by both parties, okay? That learnership agreement will stipulate the type of learnership that that employee or training program that that employee will be put on. Okay, and that learnership or when that learner qualifies, okay, it can be an NQF level and it can be an NQF level 1 to an NQF level 10. Okay, remember the agreement that was entered must be in a position of trade that was carried by that employer, and that employer has derived an income of in the definition of section 1 or from that trade. So what we're generally saying is there has to be that remuneration that we talk to. That means the employee has to be employed with you. There has to be remuneration paid over to that employee. And one, there has to be an agreement in place, okay, a learnership agreement. In order for that employer to be considered as the lead employer and for that employer to claim the annual allowance. Okay, so there allowance only applies to the period during which the learner is in party to a registered learnership agreement with the employer. Okay, and that's where the learnership agreement comes into place. And the employer will not qualify for an annual allowance. That means they can't claim the allowance if there's no learnership agreement and the learner is not registered with, or if that learner is not in employment. That means we can deduce that learner is not an employee of said company itself. It's easy for us to pick that up because remember, as an employer, if you register for PAYE, you would be issuing out IT3A certificates or IRP5 certificates as part of a reconciliation. So we can identify on those bases whether that employee was employed with the employer or not. Okay, so we have other prohibitions, specifically with regards to the learnership allowance itself. Okay, we look at section 1286. Okay, where we look at we amended it. Okay, to eliminate the requirement that an employer must take into account all previous learnership agreements from former employers. So we did an adjustment to it to accommodate whereby an employee would move from one employer to another employer. Okay, this amendment is effective for learnership agreements that are entered into or on or after the January 2013. Okay, now one thing I failed to mention is that we had something called a sunset date. A sunset date means up until where these allowance allowed to be claimed, and it was up until March 2022. So a sunset date was a date whereby we would say, when does this learnership incentive fall away? However, the minister has increased it for a further 2 years. Okay, so we have extended that with SARS as well. Okay, so it has been proposed in the budget speech. Okay, and they have extended it for a further 2 years. Okay, so also we looked at who else will not qualify for the learnership allowance. Okay, so an employer may not claim an annual allowance or any completion allowance for a registered learnership if one, a learner who is party to a new registered learnership has previously failed to complete any other registered learnership agreements. So what we're generally saying is, if the employer has put the same employee on a learnership and that employee has failed it previously, then the employer cannot claim the learnership allowance, okay, the annual or the completion allowance for said employee itself. Okay, and what we also did is where the other registered learnership agreements contain the same education and training component as the new registered learnership agreement. So what we're trying to do is we want to look at fairness in this. We want employers to give other employees an opportunity to be part of a learnership. Okay, so if you're going to continue to put the same employee on a learnership and he or she is not found competent, that means they're failing. Okay, then we will actually not allow that employer to claim the allowance itself. Okay, so the date of commencement, I've spoken about it and I've showed you the example. So in this example, we have employee's year of assessment last year of February. The employee's NQF level is 7 to NQF level 10. Okay, they commenced employment on the 3rd of January 2019 and signed a 3-year learnership agreement on the 10th of January 2019. The agreement was only registered on the 1st of March 2019. Okay, so when we look at the commencement of the annual allowance, we will look at the results as follows. The employer will be entitled to an annual allowance of 20,000 during the year of assessment ending 28th of February 2019 because the learnership agreement was entered within 12 months of the end of the 2019 year of assessment, namely the 1st of March 2019, and is accordingly deemed to have been registered on the 10th of January 2019 when the learnership agreement was entered into. So the employee was on that NQF level 7 to NQF level 10. Okay, so when we look at the NQF levels we look at the allowances that SARS will allow. Okay, we're looking at the following table. Now, for a full 12 months during a year of assessment, the annual allowance is deductible in each year of assessment in which the learnership agreement is in force. Okay, so for a full 12 months during any year, the quantum of annual allowance is equivalent to 1. If you have a learner without no disability and they're on a level NQF level 1 to 6, then you have a 40,000 Rand allowance that you can claim. Okay, if they're on an NQF level 7 to 10, then you have 20,000 that you can claim against. Okay, if you have a learner with a disability, okay, and that you put that learner in an NQF level 1 to 6, then you as the employer can claim an annual allowance of up to 60,000. And if they're NQF level 7 to 10, then you can claim an NQF level, you'll get an allowance up to an amount of 50,000 itself. Now, these changes have come into place. And the reason why we broke them down into different NQF levels, previous to these rates, the previous rates for a learner with no disability was 30,000, and to a learner with disabilities was 50,000. Okay, so what we generally found is that most employers will tend to put more of the senior staff or administration staff on learnerships and leave the lower grade staff and not allow them to go on learnerships. Okay, so the NQF levels are determined on that. So what we enticing employers to put staff members, okay, and give everyone an opportunity to get a skill or to get a qualification. So we've increased that. So if you look at somebody that's an NQF level 1 to 6, they're getting a higher allowable allowance than somebody that's on an NQF level 7 to 10. Previously, somebody with a learnership with a disability, they were allowed 50,000, but we've increased it for anybody that's with a disability that's put into a learnership that's level 1 to 6. Okay, we will give them an allowable allowance of 60,000 Rand, and NQF level 7 to 10, it's 50,000. Okay, so how these allowance will work based on when that allowance or when the date of commencement was. So example, if an individual has been put on a 12-month learnership program, okay, and say for example, and this is the worst case scenario, is that they signed that agreement on the 1st of March. Now let's look at somebody that signed an agreement on the 1st of March 2021. Okay, which is March last year, and that financial year end is ending now, and today, the 28th of February, 2022. Okay, this learner was on this learnership for that full 12-month period. So that employer, for example, if they put an employee on a NQF level 1 to 6, will be allowed to claim an allowance of 40,000 Rand for that employee. That's an annual allowance. So what does this 40,000 do? This 40,000 is directly going to impact the income tax of your business. Okay, so example, if I had 3 employees that I signed on the 1st of March 2021, okay, and I put those 3 employees on an NQF level 1 to 6. Sorry, okay, 1 to 6, okay. So that means if they are still in my employment, they still considered as employee, and they're still on the learnership, okay, then I will be allowed to claim 40,000 Rand for each employee. So 40,000 for each employee, quick max, 40 times 3, that's 120,000, okay. Say for example, my income for the year for my business was 200,000, okay. That 120,000 will be set against the 200,000. Okay, so then decreasing your taxable income. Okay, and if you're decreasing it, if for example, if you had more employees on a learnership, it could also maybe put you or the company in a loss status. Okay, that means whereby your company did run a loss. A loss doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It means that you don't have any tax that you would be required to pay for that period itself. Okay. However, if, for example, we signed an employee mid-year, then because our financial year runs from March to February, we will pro-rata the annual allowance based on the period that that employee was part of that learnership. So you're going to pro-rata the 40,000 or the 20,000 itself. Okay. So you will have also an allowance. Okay. So learnership are equal or exceeding 24 months. Now, if a learner has been found competent, okay, and has passed that specific learnership itself, that means they qualify, they would get a certificate issued out. Okay, then that means they completed that. Then the employer will be allowed to claim what we call is a completion allowance. Okay. However, if you have a learner that's an agreement, should I say, where it's more than 24 full months, okay, then what will happen is the employer, because it's more than 24 months, can multiply. Remember, we're only multiplying the completion allowance, and the completion allowance also cannot be prorated. So we multiply the completion allowance to the equivalent of the full 12-month period. So if, for example, there was over a 36-month contract learnership, then we'll multiply that over the 12-month periods of full 12-month periods. So that means you could get, for example, 3 times the annual allowance, or the completion allowance, should I say, the completion allowance. Okay. So in the following example, we have a company K. They have a December year end. That means they run from January up until December. Okay. The following learnerships agreements were entered into. Okay. So we have a learner B with an NQF level 6. That learnership agreement started on the 1st of October 2017. Okay. The term of the learnership agreement was 18 months, and they successfully completed that learnership agreement on the 30th of March 2019. Okay. Then you have learner C, who has an NQF level 8, entered on the 1st of November 2017. That term was 24 months. Okay. And 31st of October 2019, they successfully completed that. So these are learners that have no disability. Okay. So how would it work? For the 2017 tax year, okay, we will allow the annual allowance and pro-rata it for the 3 months for that tax year. So in the 2017 tax year, okay, learner B, we would have allowed a 10,000 Rand allowance for an annual allowance. For learner C, because there was only 2 months on it, and because of the NQF level, they were only awarded the 20,000, they will be allowed the 3,333. So for the 2017 tax year, that employer under Section 12H could have claimed an allowance of 13,330. That means this will be deducted from the income itself. Okay, so decrease in the income means the lower tax they would have paid on the lower amount itself. That's one. Then we look at December. Now remember that we did advise the financial year end is in December. So March 2018 to December 2018, learner B would have been in that learnership for a full 12-month period. So we will allow the 40,000. Learner C will be a full 12-month period, and that we will allow the 20,000. So in the 2018 financial year, they would, under Section 12H, have an allowable deduction of 60,000. Okay, so this is based on the annual allowance. Okay, in the year end 31st of December 2019. Okay, remember, depending on the number of months, remember if it was an 18-month and a 24-month, okay, we're going to look at the balance of the period that the learner was during that year of assessment. Okay, so learner A in the 2019 period was only 3 months there. So they would have allowed the annual allowance of 10,000. learner A's completion allowance. So remember, we found him competent. He or she completed it, and we would have allowed 40,000 Rand as a completion allowance in that year. So in the year that they've completed the allowance, the employer can claim the completion allowance. Remember, we can only prorata the annual allowance, but the completion allowance is still 40,000. Okay, so for learner A, you could have claimed, you would be allowed to claim an allowance of 50,000, a 10,000 for the annual allowance, and a 40,000 Rand for the completion allowance. Then we have learner B. Learner B's annual allowance is going to be for 10 months, okay, and that will be an amount of 16,667, okay, and because learner B completed it within the 2019 tax year, we would consider the 2 consecutive 12-month period. That means it was over a 24-month period. So we will take the annual allowance, or should I say completion allowance, and multiply it by the 2 consecutive 12-month period, which is 40,000. So learner B, the allowance, the annual and completion would have been about 56,667. In the 2019 tax year, this employer would have claimed an allowance under Section 12H of 106,667. Now, remember, and something that you need to project, if this is only for 2 employees, imagine if they had 4 or 5 employees, this amount could have been increased. Yet again, when employers ask, what is it in for me? These are the incentives that's available. It's legal. It's for you to utilize, because at the end of the day, you actually, as a small business or as a business, you're actually decreasing the unemployment rate and actually increasing the skills development rate as well. Okay, so imagine if you had 5 employees and you multiplied this by 5. Imagine how much in that year the employer would have an allowable deduction. Okay, so with regards to most companies, they are encouraged to hire or hire individuals with disability. Okay, so if you're looking at somebody or individual or a person with disability, the incentive or the allowance is much higher. Okay, as I mentioned, the 60,000 and the 50,000. Okay, however, in order for that employee to be considered as a person with disability, okay, they must have what we call, or the employer has to have what we refer to as an ITRDD. It's basically a disability form that defines the employee's disability. This form needs to be completed by the specialist that diagnose that type of disability. Okay, if the employee is in a possession of one and provides it to the employer, then the employer can utilize the disability rates. Okay, so it's important that you take consideration for individuals with disability, and they must be in a possession of a signed ITR-DD form. This form can be downloaded from the SARS website and given, and the employee can get it completed and signed off and stamped by the registered practitioner. Okay, unfortunately, they can't have this form completed by a normal general doctor. It has to be somebody, a specialist that deals with those type of disability or can diagnose those type of disabilities. Okay. Also, with individuals with disabilities, any bona fide bursary or scholarships granted to enable or assist any person who with a disability, as defined in Section 6B1, to study at a recognized educational and research institution may be exempt. Okay, so we're looking at what if you're appointing them to a learnership agreement or not. We have to look at Section 6B on it. Okay, so these are information that you as the employer would need to keep on hand. If, for example, do get ordered, if you feel that you have claimed the allowance, the ITR-DD will be required as part of your evidence to SARS to say that this person that you claim for this allowance is a person with a disability. Okay. Okay, so this is basically just reiterating the amounts of the learners and the learnership agreements. Okay. So these are, when we talk about the bursaries, so employers can grant employees bursaries, okay, depending on the type of industry they are, okay. And remember, these bursaries will be directly related to the job that they do, okay. And with regards to that, they have exemptions of these, okay. We're looking at the 90,000 in higher education, okay. And we looked at the remuneration that for that employee does not exceed up to 600,000 in the year. Okay, so these are actually bursaries that you can look in, and this is in form of the PAYE itself. Okay, so the completion allowance, I've explained the completion allowance. Remember, I said if it's more than 24 months, you can multiply it by the full 12-month period, the number of full 12-month periods. Okay, remember, the completion allowance is granted as a once-off over and above your annual allowance itself. Okay, but that's provided that that learner has completed that learnership itself. Okay, so SARS requires sufficient proof of a successful completion of the learnership agreement in order to allow the completion allowance under Section 12H. Normally, confirmation from the relevant SETA is accepted by SARS to be confirmation of successful completion. Many employers, however, are having difficulty in obtaining this confirmation from the SETAs in the year of assessment, okay, in which the learnership agreement was completed. So you would have an incident whereby the learner has been found competent, but the SETA cannot provide them with a confirmation of completion or successful completion of it, okay? So in those scenarios, SARS can request the following: a statement of a result issued by the accredited training provider, or an evaluation report by the registered assessor on the workplace experience, okay? So if you have that in place, you can use it as proof that the learner has completed and you are allowed to claim it. Okay. Also, what the employer needs to complete is what we call an IT 180, which is downloaded from our SARS website. It needs to be completed for each learner that's registered to a learnership agreement, so that you have a record of every learner and the allowance that you claim per learner per year of assessment itself. Okay, so as we looked at the learnership allowance itself, just to reiterate, the completion allowance, okay, once completed, they allow the NQF level 1 to 6 for 40,000, NQF level 7 to 10 for 20, NQF level 1 to 6 for somebody with a disability of 60, and NQF level 1 to 7 for 50. So these are the completion allowance that they will be allowed. Okay, so remember, annual allowance is one and completion allowance is the next. Okay, so the reporting requirements, and this is upon our Section 12H8. Okay, remember, I'm just making mention of these sections. Doesn't mean that you have to go and read it. But if you download the Interpretation Note 20 Issue 8 I've mentioned, it has all this information in it and is broken down as well. Okay, so the Section 12H8 requires an employer to become entitled to deduct the annual allowance or the completion allowance in respect of any assessment. Okay, so in the year of assessment that the learner is registered with. Okay, I've explained the year of assessments, I've explained the commencement, so we allow you to claim it. Okay, one, the SETA is required under Section 12H to submit the Minister of Finance of any information relating to that learnership agreement required by the Minister in form and manner and at the place and time that the Minister prescribes. Okay, so the more the SETAs provide the Minister of Finance with feedback or information regarding to learnership, the more that the Minister of Finance will understand whether employers are utilizing this incentive. Okay, based on that information that is provided by the SETAs, the minister can then decide whether to extend the learnership agreement or learnership program for lengthier periods. Okay, but if we don't have valid information, that if we don't have employers utilizing the benefits of the learnership allowance, then it's something that the Minister of Finance says it's not working. It's something that it's an incentive that we provide. Employees are not utilizing it well. So why not just stop it across the board? Okay, but since the inception of it, okay, this hasn't stopped. Okay, so I think it's since 2001, October 2001, it has been extended and extended. So they see some changes, they see some growth, they see some need for it, okay, because based on information that we have. But if employees are not utilizing the allowance correctly, okay, then there's nothing stopping the Minister of Finance to say, you know what, we can cancel it. We don't, it's not working out. He will bring it, the learnership allowance to an end. Okay. So that's about it when it comes directly to the section 12H. Okay, so key aspects that you need to take away from this presentation: one, employer, employee, and remuneration. Okay, they go hand in hand. Next is a learnership agreement that the employer signs with the employee. Okay, and then the employer registers it with a registered SETA itself. The next thing that you need to do is keep accurate records to make sure that encourage your employees to remain on that learnership, to do the utmost best, because one, they will get skills plus, and they'll get a qualification, and then you as the employer then, based on them staying on it, can claim the annual allowance, and if they complete it, then you can claim the completion allowance. Okay, so remember, the lead employer can claim the annual allowance up until the time the employee was registered with them, but the next employer, which will be if the employee moves over and continues with the learnership, then that employer can claim the remainder of the annual allowance and claim the completion allowance. So those are things that you need to take into consideration. So it's up to you as an employer to take note of this. It benefits you. It encourages you to take your employees and put them onto a program. Give them some skills, give them some qualification, because we all want to grow. And this is where you benefit as an employer on it. So with that being said, thank you very much. My presentation has been concluded. Is there any questions?
What a wonderful presentation. Wow. I could actually listen to you for the whole day. And thank you for this mouthful of information. Thanks. I'm sure the dealers on the line and business people in general on the line would probably want to throw one or two questions. But you've answered a lot of the questions I had personally. I think you should have been a teacher in your other life. You're very good.
That's fantastic.
Sabanella, I just want to maybe I don't know how often you'll do these type of workshops or with your stakeholders, all right? But as I said, the learnership allowance is just one, and this affects your income tax. So maybe on your next session, you can call me back, and maybe I can do ETI, which is Employment Tax Incentive, which is also interesting because it's an incentive you can run concurrently. You got your learnership, which you can claim the allowance, plus you got your employee tax incentive you can do at the same time, and that will affect PAYE. So something that maybe you can dangle in front of you as a carrot, just to say, hey guys, there's more information, there's more incentives that they can have. And believe me, this is the best smile from SARS you're ever gonna get. The friendliest face from SARS you're gonna get.
It's normally the other way around, Martin. So it's just been the most insightful presentation. I mean, I think everyone learns from such. Yeah, it's a fantastic presentation. I don't know if anyone on the line has any questions that maybe you want to ask Martin while we've got him in the call.
Yeah.
Maybe just raise your hand, so then Mr. Chaba can get to the questions. I know, Fazana, you've asked a couple of things on the side, so we've responded to those. I don't know if there's anyone else that wants to just unmute your mic and you can ask your question.
Certainly,
can I ask one question?
Up on that challenge, Martin. Definitely going to have you back to talk about ETIs. These are just sore points for dealers. So I think, and you're quite informative. So we'll definitely arrange something. Mas Chaba will be in touch with you.
Okay. Can I maybe ask one question to the audience? You don't have to, just by a raise of hands. How many of them are actually utilizing the learnership allowance? That's a good question. And how is it affecting them?
Using it and knowing about it were the first two. The first thing was actually knowing about it, because I think so I mean, you've gone through the practical side of it, actually how it affects your bottom line. So if you really do the calculations, you can actually see you'll see the benefit.
Correct, 100%.
But I don't know, is there anyone on the line that wants to comment on that? You'll get an extra allowance if you comment today.
I can tell you, though, that there is not so many dealers that have taken advantage of these. And that is the reason why we decided to have this webinar, because most dealers have no idea about these. And I think you're just opening our eyes now. So even our own internal staff have been a lot more capacitated and will be able to just become your extension out there as well. So, but I will definitely take you up on that offer. I will definitely do that.
Thank you. Okay. Guys, you don't need to be scared, hey. I don't understand. Don't be scared.
No, you know what? I don't know. The next thing you're gonna ask me for my text number, and then you.
Not now. That's on second presentation only.
You just want to make sure everyone pays their prof tax today. That's all, Martin.
Yeah. I don't. Sabinello, you mentioned, people are scared to pay tax and whether they're not to pay tax. But the understanding is that, you know what, if nobody pays tax, then we can't run out programs. We can't allow incentives. We can't do grants. Now look at the common factors, right? What is taxpayers' money utilized for? Infrastructure, education, paying of social grants. Now we got those 350 grants that we're paying as well. Understand? So a lot of people under the concept. Now imagine nobody pays tax, right? I'm telling you, just look at it. If nobody says, you know what, we're not going to pay tax. So how are we going to then, one, pay school teachers, nurses, doctors? And I can guarantee you at one stage, all of us benefited from taxpayers' money. Not to say, not everybody you can say that can afford medical aid. How many of us you can say, hey, they've utilized government hospitals? So it's something where you got to think out of the box. Yes, we are just the collecting agents for government. Okay, we provide. So that's what our job. That's our mandate. It's just up to the Minister of Finance how he distributes. And then if you listen to the last budget speech, he did give some relief to taxpayers as well. And you look at small businesses. Your tax rates was 28%. He's actually decreased it to 27%. Understand? So it's something whereby small business, we can see now, you know what, we don't want to attack everybody, but we want to give some kind of benefit towards that. I can see Jared has his hand raised.
Martin, all we wanted you to sort out was the corruption. Then we sorted. Then we don't mind paying the 28%.
Imagine me smiling and saying, hey, pay corrupt. I need to be stern on that. But remember, if you're going to be too stern, people are not going to be voluntarily compliant, understand? So we need to actually relax people's minds, understand, we're here to help, we're here to assist. SARS services is 100% free. So our advice is free. We can guide you through processes. Okay.
Sure.
I got Jared's hand up there. I don't know if he's got a question.
Can go ahead, Jared.
Unmute your mic there, Jared, and you can speak.
Maybe it's what they call a legacy hand.
Okay.
Okay. All right. I'm not sure in the chat box if there are any further questions, but what we're going to do for the benefit of everyone else and those that couldn't log in for different reasons, as Mark said earlier on, we will make these available in our platforms, various platforms, including website and so forth, so that you can also go back and refresh. Yeah.
I think
you will share the presentations. Okay. So, all right. So you
just wanting to check if there's anyone else that wants to ask questions. I think there was a challenge with someone trying to unmute their mic and they weren't able to unmute. Maybe Richard and Masachaba can just have a look into that. I think Jared was trying to unmute.
okay.
Just it's not allowing them to unmute.
Well, I think what you can do, Jared, is probably just drop your question on the chat box. The guys will probably be able to respond to you on the chat box. If you could put up contact details for PetroCONNECT again, if you can, just so that if you want to just get in touch with us and there's anything else, follow-up stuff that you're just needing assistance on, you're welcome to hook us up there. We also just be on the lookout. We are going to invite Martin back. We're just going to look at the calendars and then we'll chat more about the ETIs as he has made promises to you. So yeah, we'll make sure that happens.
Please, if you are also not signed up to newsletters or following Facebook pages or the like, please just make sure you go onto the PetroCONNECT website and just sign up on the website because I know some of you have received this link via other platforms like WhatsApp, etc. So just make sure you're on there so then you do get the monthly newsletters, you get invites to these sort of presentations, and you know this is something that we will be doing on an ongoing basis and obviously is completely free of charge and will continue to be that way. So we enjoy sharing the different insights, and you know feel free to just get in touch if you've got any queries or want to just bounce ideas or anything like that regarding the various different services that we can assist with. Is there anyone else that would like to ask any other questions? If you do have, just write it on the chat box, then we can answer those questions and we'll give you the presentation, so that will be available. So we know there's lots to take in after this.
All right. Before you doze off, I think let's call it a day.
Yep.
Yeah, it's been a great one, and thank you so much once again, Martin and Shelley. You've been
Thanks, Martin.
Wonderful speakers for us today, and we really do appreciate your time. And thank you to all the business people that have logged in. Some are at dealers already. Some could see some names there for people that are about to take over their sites. So this is information that's quite vital for you. So you're quite lucky to know all these things prior to you taking over your site. So yeah, great one. And thank you so much again. Those that would need to hook up Walter for labor relations stuff and anything like that, Walter's contacts have been shared on the chat box. If you're needing anything to do with trainings and you needing assistance in as far as that is concerned, or all the stuff that we're talking about, please make sure that you get in touch with Keta. We will just put Keta's email there as well on the chat box so that you can hook Keta up. Yeah, and I think that's it for the day.
Yeah, any general queries, just drop it at info@petroconnect.co. Jared, I see you can try and unmute, but quick question, can an employer award a learnership to an employee's offspring? And if so, do all Section 12H deductions still apply? I'm not sure whether you want to take that question, Martin, if you're still there.
Okay, I'm still here. So if the employer, for example, remember the three steps I said. It has to be an employer, there has to be an employee, and there has to be a remuneration. Okay. So if those three factors play, then yes, and if that employee is within the means of that, then yes, Section 12H will still apply. It's just that when you looked at connected persons under the ETI Act, that means their offsprings wouldn't be able to qualify for that. Okay. So I hope that answers.
Answers that one, Jared. Cool. Great. Thank you very much to you all. We spot on time. All the best for the rest of your evenings, and we'll chat on the other side.
Thank you, guys. Cheers. Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks, Martin.
Thanks,
Thanks, Shane.